The room is quiet in the way expensive rooms always are. Glass walls, steel frames, a skyline stretched out like a trophy behind them. 5 executives sit around the table, relaxed, confident, used to being obeyed. Then there's her, standing. No tailored suit, no leather briefcase, just a plain blouse, slightly wrinkled at the cuffs, hands folded tightly in front of her. When she clears her throat, the sound feels too small for a room like this. She says her name. Then she says the sentence that changes everything. "Sir, I'm the new owner of this company." For half a second, no one reacts. Then the CEO laughs. Not a polite laugh, a real one. He leans back, shakes his head, looks at the others like he's been handed a joke. Someone smirks. Someone whispers, "Is this a prank?" Another voice, lower, sharper, says, "Should we call security?" She doesn't sit down. She doesn't argue. She just stands there, heart racing, because what none of them noticed is the signature at the bottom of the document already on the table. Before we go any further, before we continue the story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We genuinely love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, let's stay right here for a moment because this is where most people would fold. This is where embarrassment takes over, where you apologize for speaking out of turn, where you shrink yourself to match how others see you. Think about it honestly. If that laughter was aimed at you, would you still be standing there? Or would you already be looking for the door? Her name is Emily Carter. She's 32 years old, and this is the first time in her life she has ever been inside a boardroom like this. 6 months earlier, she was sitting on the edge of her childhood bed, the same bed she slept in at 16, holding a manila envelope that felt heavier than it looked. Her father, Daniel Carter, had passed away unexpectedly after a short illness. No dramatic last words, no long goodbye, just a phone call at 6:14 a.m. and the quiet aftermath that follows. Daniel had worked for this company for 27 years, not as an executive, not as a name on the wall. He was an operations manager, the kind of man who arrived early, fixed problems no one noticed, and left late without mentioning it. At home, he smelled like coffee and printer ink. He used to say, half joking, "If you do your job right, nobody claps. They just keep expecting more." Emily hadn't thought much about his work beyond that. She knew he was tired a lot. She knew he believed in loyalty, maybe too much. When the lawyer called her in, she assumed it would be about his savings, his house, his old pickup truck. Instead, the lawyer slid a folder across the desk and said, "Your father made some arrangements you weren't aware of." Inside were documents showing a quiet, patient story unfolding over decades. Stock options earned instead of bonuses. Shares bought when the company was struggling and everyone else was selling. Agreements signed and stored away. Daniel never talked about it. Not once. He never wanted Emily to feel like her future depended on money she didn't earn. But by the time the paperwork was complete, there was no way around it. Emily Carter owned 51% of the company. Back in the boardroom, the CEO finally wipes his eyes and looks at her again, this time with mild annoyance. "Miss, I don't know who put you up to this, but we're in the middle of—" She interrupts him, voice shaking just enough to be human. "You're in the middle of reviewing last quarter's numbers. Page 12. The logistics losses came from the Midwest Distribution Center. The same one my father warned you about in writing. Twice." The room shifts. Chairs creak. A woman at the far end of the table glances down at the document in front of her. Another executive frowns, flipping pages. Emily keeps going, not because she's fearless, but because she's angry. Angry that the man who was laughed off emails is being laughed off again, even now. She reaches forward and gently taps the corner of the contract. "My name is here," she says. "And his." The laughter doesn't stop all at once. It fades unevenly like a radio losing signal. The CEO's smile tightens. "Even if that were true," he says, "ownership doesn't mean you walk in here and take over." Emily nods. "I know," she says. "That's why I didn't fire anyone. That's why I didn't cancel this meeting. I just wanted to see who would listen before they knew who I was." There's a long silence. And in that silence, something uncomfortable settles in. Because they're realizing this woman didn't sneak in. She was invited. The assistant at the door knew her name. Security waved her through. The system they trusted worked exactly as designed. Just not for them. How many times, you have to wonder, have people like Emily been ignored simply because they didn't look the part? 3 weeks later, the headlines start quietly. No flashy language. Just filings. Leadership changes. Internal reviews. Emily doesn't give interviews. She spends her mornings in the same Midwest distribution center her father wrote about, walking the floor, listening to workers who are shocked she knows their names. One man pulls her aside and says, "Your dad used to bring donuts on Fridays when morale was bad." Emily smiles, then cries in her car afterward, because grief doesn't follow a schedule. The twist in this story isn't revenge. It's restraint. She keeps most of the executives, even the CEO for now, but she makes one change that matters. She opens the old email archive and reads every message her father sent that went unanswered. Then she fixes what he tried to fix. Slowly, publicly, on record. A year later, profits stabilize. Turnover drops. The boardroom looks the same, but the air is different. Emily sits at the table now, not at the head, but among them. She keeps her father's pen in her pocket, the one he used to sign documents at the kitchen table late at night. Sometimes she thinks about that first day, the laughter, the way it burned. And she asks herself a question she never answers out loud. If her last name wasn't on that paper, would anything have changed? And here's the question for you. If you were in that room, would you have laughed too? Would you have dismissed her? Or would you have noticed the signature before the pause? Stories like this aren't really about power. They're about listening, and about how often the people we overlook are the ones holding everything together. Before we go deeper, take a moment and tell us where you're watching from. These stories reach people in different places, different seasons of life, and we truly read every comment. And if stories like this matter to you, stories about being underestimated, about quiet strength, about moments that change everything, subscribe now because you won't want to miss what's coming next. Richard Hale built his reputation the way some men build walls, thick, high, and without windows. He started with nothing, at least that's the story he preferred to tell, and turned a struggling regional firm into a national powerhouse. Inside the industry, his name carried weight. He was decisive, sharp-tongued, and famously unforgiving. People said meetings with Richard Hale felt less like discussions and more like verdicts. If he liked you, you advanced. If he didn't, you disappeared quietly, often with a polite email and a cardboard box. The board around him reflected that same energy. Long tenure, familiar faces, people who had benefited from his favor and learned when to nod. They trusted numbers, titles, and patterns that made sense to them. They didn't like surprises, especially the kind that walked in without credentials printed on thick paper. To them, authority had a uniform and she wasn't wearing it. The woman standing in front of them knew all of this. She didn't offer her resume. She didn't list accomplishments. She didn't raise her voice to be heard. She stood still and let the room tell her exactly who these people were. She had learned that skill long before this moment, sitting at the edge of the kitchen table while her father talked through work problems he never fully explained. She learned how powerful men spoke when they assumed no one important was listening. She learned how silence made people careless. So when Richard Hale waved his hand dismissively, when another board member checked his phone, when someone sighed as if she were wasting oxygen, she let it happen. Not because she was unsure, but because she understood timing. She didn't interrupt them, because she'd waited 15 years for this moment. 15 years earlier, she was still a teenager, doing homework at that same kitchen table, when her father came home later than usual. His tie was loose, his shoulders slumped. He didn't complain, not directly. He just said, "Some people don't hear you unless you're loud enough to scare them." At the time, she thought it was advice about school, about life. Only later did she realize he was talking about work, about emails that went unanswered, about warnings buried under confidence and quarterly wins. He believed in process, in patience, in doing things the right way even when shortcuts were rewarded. And that belief followed him all the way to the end. Standing in that boardroom now, she could almost hear his voice reminding her not to rush, not to explain herself to people who had already decided what she was worth. The board saw what they expected to see: a young woman with no visible allies, someone calm to the point of passivity. They filled in the blanks themselves, and every assumption made them more comfortable. Richard Hale leaned forward, fingers steepled, the posture of a man used to control. He spoke about responsibility, about experience, about how companies aren't run on feelings. As he talked, she noticed the faint scratch on the table near his elbow, the place where her father once rested his pen during a late meeting years ago. It grounded her. This wasn't abstract. This wasn't symbolic. This was real. Real people. Real consequences. Real history sitting between polished chairs. She watched them talk over her as if she weren't there, and she catalogued everything. Who avoided eye contact. Who looked uneasy. Who laughed a second too late. These details mattered, because power doesn't just live in contracts and shares. It lives in habits, and habits reveal fear faster than words ever could. She didn't need to defend herself yet. She didn't need to correct them. All she needed was for them to keep going, to show her exactly how they treated someone they believed was powerless. And here's something worth asking yourself. Have you ever been underestimated so completely that people told you who they really were without realizing it? Because that kind of moment changes how you see the world. And for her, it confirmed something she already knew. This room wasn't just a test of authority. It was a mirror. They stop speaking to her and start speaking around her, as if she's part of the furniture. The discussion shifts to projections, then to blame. One executive insists the losses were unavoidable. Another says the warnings came too late. They talk faster now, louder, interrupting each other, each sentence layered with certainty. Richard Hale lets it run for a moment, enjoying it, then raises a hand. Silence snaps into place. He smiles, glancing at her like she's a misplaced intern. This is what leadership looks like, he says lightly. Not announcements. Decisions. A few people chuckle. One laugh lingers too long. It lands wrong, heavy in the air, and for the first time, someone notices her hands. She's holding a folded document, edges worn soft, creases deep from being unfolded and refolded again and again. Her fingers tighten around it, not in anger, but restraint. She keeps her eyes level, her face calm, because reacting would give them something they don't deserve yet. Richard leans back, crossing his arms. Miss, he says, tone casual. Even if you believe what you're saying, belief doesn't make it real. Another executive adds, ownership isn't a feeling, it's earned. The room hums with agreement. She doesn't answer. Instead, she listens, and with every sentence, the discomfort grows. The subtle at first. Pause where there shouldn't be one. A board member clearing his throat. Someone finally asking, why hasn't legal addressed this? No one responds. The assistant at the door avoids eye contact. The silence stretches. She shifts her weight slightly, the paper crackling almost imperceptibly. That sound pulls her backward in time, to the worst night of her life. A hospital hallway that smelled like disinfectant and old coffee. The doctor's voice steady, practiced. Her phone buzzing unanswered because her father never checked it after 9 p.m. That was the night the paper in her hands was signed. Not ceremoniously. Not with witnesses. Just a pen borrowed from a nurse's desk. Her father's handwriting shaky but deliberate. He looked at her then and said, promise me you won't rush. She didn't understand what he meant. She promised anyway. Back in the boardroom, Richard makes another joke, sharper this time. If this is some kind of inheritance confusion, we can recommend excellent counsel. A few smiles appear, forced now. The joke sits there, uncomfortable. She feels the familiar pressure behind her eyes but refuses it. Grief taught her discipline. Silence taught her patience. And patience taught her this moment would reveal more than any argument ever could. She doesn't interrupt because power hates being watched. It starts to unravel under its own confidence. They keep debating as if she's invisible. Numbers fly. Strategies collide. Voices overlap. And yet, something has shifted. One executive finally looks directly at her, then at the document, then away. Another checks the signature page on the table again. Slower this time. Richard notices the change and frowns. He straightens in his chair, irritation flashing across his face. Is there a reason we're indulging this? He asks. No one answers immediately. That's when she exhales, slow and controlled. She doesn't raise her voice. She doesn't accuse. She simply unfolds the paper in her hands and places it gently on the table, aligning it with the others as if it has always belonged there. The room goes quiet, Not because she demanded it, but because they finally understand something doesn't fit the story they were telling themselves. She looks at Richard, really looks at him, and for the first time speaks without shaking. "You're right," she says. "Ownership isn't a feeling." Her eyes drop briefly to the page, then back up. It's a record. The air feels heavier now, charged. Someone swallows hard. Another shifts in their seat. Think about this for a second. Have you ever been so sure of your position that you stopped checking the details? Have you ever talked over someone long enough to forget they might be holding proof? She waits, giving them space to connect the dots themselves. Because once they do, there's no going back. Silence has done its work. 15 years earlier. The night smelled like wet concrete and exhaust. Cold rain fell in thin, relentless sheets, the kind that soaks through clothes without ever feeling dramatic about it. A single mother stood at a bus stop with a young girl beside her. Shoulders hunched, coat too light for the weather. The girl's shoes were damp, socks clinging uncomfortably, and every passing car sent a small splash toward the curb. They had been standing there longer than planned. The last bus had already gone by without stopping, its interior lights glowing warm as it disappeared down the road. The woman checked her wallet again, even though she already knew what was inside. Nothing new would appear. No forgotten bill. No miracle. She pressed her lips together, calculating whether walking the remaining miles was possible before the rain turned into something worse. The girl didn't complain. She just watched the rain, blinking it out of her eyes, learning a lesson she wouldn't understand until much later. That was when Richard Hale appeared, not as someone important, not as a savior, just as a man running late. He stepped out of a car parked awkwardly near the curb, phone pressed to his ear, frustration tight in his voice. His suit was expensive but tired, collar slightly askew, shoes already scuffed from a long day. He paced while he listened, nodding to someone who couldn't see him, eyes scanning emails on a glowing screen. Success clung to him in subtle ways, but so did emptiness. He had money, momentum, and a calendar packed so tightly there was no room to breathe. When he finally ended the call, he exhaled sharply and noticed them. Just for a moment. Then he looked away. He almost walked past them, already halfway to the sidewalk, already telling himself it wasn't his problem. The woman shifted, pulling the girl closer as the rain picked up. A bus stop sign rattled softly above them, loose metal tapping against itself. Richard stopped. Not because of guilt. Not because of obligation. Just a pause, the kind that happens when something familiar brushes against a memory you don't look at often. He turned back and cleared his throat. "You're welcome to stand under the awning," he said, pointing to the narrow overhang of the closed cafe behind him. It wasn't much, barely enough to shield two people. But it was dry. The woman hesitated, pride warring with practicality, then nodded. "Thank you," she said quietly. He unlocked the cafe door long enough to step inside and came back with 2 paper cups of tea, steam rising into the cold air. "It's not great," he added, "but it's warm." They stood there together, the rain doing most of the talking. For 5 minutes, that was all it was. Shelter, heat, silence. Then the woman spoke softly, as if afraid of taking up space. She explained the missed bus, the job that cut her hours without warning, the rent due in 2 days. She didn't ask for help. She just talked, and Richard listened in a way he hadn't listened to anyone in a long time. He nodded. He asked one question, then another. The girl watched him carefully, memorizing his face without knowing why. When he glanced at his watch, she thought he would leave. He almost did. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document, something he had been meaning to review later. "I don't usually do this," he said, more to himself than to them. What he signed that night wasn't meant to matter. It was a temporary authorization, a small transfer of shares he barely glanced at, his mind already racing ahead to the next meeting, the next flight, the next obligation. He scribbled his signature quickly, the pen scratching against damp paper. "This should help for now," he said, handing it over with a card. "Call the number tomorrow." She took it with shaking hands, nodding, thanking him, not realizing the weight of what she held. She never told him her name. He didn't ask. The rain slowed. A bus finally appeared at the end of the street, headlights cutting through the dark. As they boarded, the girl looked back once. Richard was already walking away, phone back in hand, his part in the moment filed away as finished. Years passed. The girl grew up. The woman worked 2 jobs, then 3, slowly stabilizing, always careful, always counting. The document stayed folded in a drawer, untouched, because life was louder than paperwork. By the time anyone realized its significance, it was too late to undo. And now, sitting in a boardroom filled with glass and laughter, that girl stood grown, calm, holding the same paper, creased and softened by time. Think about it for a moment. How many moments like that have passed through your life? Small choices. 5 minutes. A signature done without thinking. What if the thing you barely remember changed someone's entire future? And what if the person you once helped without noticing is standing quietly in front of you now, waiting for you to remember? The signature itself took less than 10 seconds. Richard held the pen between his fingers, feeling the weight of the day pressing down on him. The rain had followed him under the awning, tapping softly against the paper as he unfolded it with one hand. He skimmed the top line, not really reading, just confirming what he assumed he already knew. Temporary assistance. Minor transfer. Something his legal team could clean up later if needed. His assistant stood a few steps away, phone in hand, whispering reminders about the dinner he was already late for, the investor waiting, the call he couldn't miss. Richard nodded, distracted, eyes flicking between the page and the glowing screen. The pen hovered for a brief moment, a hesitation so small it barely registered as a choice. Then the tip touched the paper. Ink spread slightly where a raindrop landed, blurring the edge of a letter. He didn't notice. He signed the way busy people sign things. Fast, confident, final. He handed the document back without ceremony, already half turned away. "This should get you through," he said, voice neutral, almost rehearsed. In his mind, it was charity paperwork. A gesture. A line item. Something kind but forgettable. He believed real power lived elsewhere, in boardrooms and contracts that mattered, in meetings with people who wore suits like his. His assistant cleared her throat again, urgency creeping into her tone. Richard folded the pen into his pocket and stepped out into the rain, the sound of it growing louder as he moved away. The paper stayed behind, damp at the edges, held carefully against a woman's chest as if it might dissolve. She didn't look at it right away. She focused on getting her child home, on the warmth of the bus, on the small relief of surviving another night. The signature rested quietly, patient, waiting for time to do what people often underestimate it can do. That pen would be replaced dozens of times over the years. Offices would change. Assistants would come and go. Richard's signature would appear on deals worth millions, on decisions that reshaped careers and markets. And yet, that one, written in a hurry, under a leaking awning with rain staining the page, would outlive all of it. It would sit untouched while his empire grew and cracked and grew again. It would survive audits, downturns, leadership changes, and the slow erosion of memory. Think about how many things you've signed without reading closely. How many moments you rushed through because something else felt more important. What if the smallest signature you ever wrote turned out to be the one that mattered most? Because that night, without realizing it, Richard Hale put his name on a future he would one day be forced to face. The memory loosens its grip, and the room comes back into focus. Glass walls, leather chairs, the quiet hum of the city far below. The document lies open on the table now, no longer folded, no longer protected by her hands. One of the executives has picked it up, adjusting his glasses, finally reading instead of assuming. His brow tightens as his eyes move down the page, slower with every line. He doesn't speak right away. The silence stretches, different from before. Not dismissive, curious, heavy. Another executive leans closer, trying to see without asking. Richard notices the change and straightens, his earlier ease slipping just enough to be visible. "Is there a problem?" he asks, irritation edging into his voice. The executive clears his throat. This is an old authorization," he says carefully. "Filed, but never reversed." Papers shuffle. Someone flips to the back page, fingers tracing the signature as if it might vanish under scrutiny. The laughter that once filled the room doesn't stop all at once. It fades unevenly, awkwardly, replaced by the sound of breathing, of chairs shifting, of people recalculating in real time. A woman on the board presses her lips together, eyes fixed on the date. Another quietly pulls up archived records on a tablet, her confidence draining with each swipe. Richard's jaw tightens. He recognizes the signature now. He recognizes the pen stroke, the slight slant of his name. Recognition lands not as clarity, but as discomfort. The young woman remains standing, calm, almost detached, watching the truth do the work for her. She doesn't smile. She doesn't speak. She lets the room change around her. One executive finally breaks the silence. His voice barely above a whisper, meant for no one and everyone at once. That can't be right. The words hang there, fragile and exposed, as the weight of the past presses into the present. The legal language is dry, almost boring, which makes it harder to argue with. Clause by clause, the truth settles in. The document is legitimate, properly filed, witnessed, time-stamped. It wasn't a gift. It wasn't charity. It was a long-term trust arrangement tied to specific conditions that had been fulfilled quietly, patiently, over years. No announcements, no reminders, just compliance. Shares transferred incrementally, triggered by performance benchmarks and tenure milestones the company celebrated without ever tracing them back to their source. The system did what it was designed to do. It just did it without asking permission. A lawyer on the board finally exhales. This gives her controlling interest, he says, voice flat with disbelief. The room absorbs that sentence like a shockwave. Richard shakes his head once, slow, as if refusing a bad memory. That's not possible, he says. But the words don't carry conviction. He reaches for the document himself now, reading more carefully than he ever has. His finger pauses at the date. Then the signature. His signature. The confusion gives way to something else, something colder. Recognition doesn't arrive with clarity. It arrives with a feeling. The smell of rain. The sound of water hitting metal. The uncomfortable patience of a night he thought meant nothing. He remembers the rain before he remembers her face. And when the memory completes itself, dread follows close behind. Not fear of losing control, but the realization that this outcome was never sudden. It was always moving toward him, quietly, while he focused on louder victories. Across the table, the board begins to understand the scale of it. This wasn't a hostile takeover. There was no ambush, no manipulation, just time. Someone mutters, "Why didn't this come up sooner?" Another answers without looking up, "Because no one was looking." The woman finally sits, folding her hands in her lap, posture steady. She has waited long enough. 15 years of compliance. 15 years of silence. 15 years of letting a promise mature into fact. Think about that for a moment. How many outcomes are already in motion in your life, built on choices you barely remember making? And how often do we mistake quiet patience for weakness, right up until it speaks? The confirmation comes quietly, the way irreversible truths often do. Legal counsel joins by phone, voices careful, precise, leaving no room for interpretation. Every question is answered the same way. Yes, it's valid. Yes, it's enforceable. Yes, the conditions were met. One by one, the arguments collapse. The board shifts from disbelief to urgency, voices overlapping now, not with confidence but with concern. Someone asks about contingency plans. Someone else asks how this was missed. Another asks who knew. No one answers directly. Papers slide across the table. Hands tremble just enough to be noticed. This isn't chaos. It's something colder. A sudden awareness that the ground they've been standing on has always belonged to someone else, and they simply never noticed. Richard doesn't speak for a long time. He sits back, eyes fixed on the table, as if staring hard enough might rearrange the facts. He wasn't robbed. He wasn't tricked. No one exploited a loophole behind his back. The truth settles slowly, painfully. He gave this away, freely, casually, on a night he barely remembered. The power he built, the authority he guarded so closely, was undone not by an enemy, but by his own handwriting. There's no anger in his face now, just a hollow understanding. He looks at her again, really looks this time, searching for accusation, for triumph. He finds neither. That unsettles him more than any gloating ever could. The board waits for her to speak, bracing for consequences. Firings, public statements, retribution disguised as reform. Instead, She remained still, letting the room sit with itself. She never chased revenge. She waited for timing. That difference matters. Timing turns emotion into outcome. Revenge burns fast and leaves nothing usable behind. Timing builds quietly and arrives prepared. Think about that for a second. How often do we confuse restraint for weakness? How often do we mistake silence for surrender? She didn't need to prove anything in this moment. The proof was already written, already filed, already lived. All she had to do was show up and let the truth finish what patience started. Richard leans back in his chair, staring at the table as if it could explain itself. He isn't evil. Not in the way movies show villains. He's not cruel by design. He's simply been careless, letting ambition and routines overshadow the people around him. The successes insulated him, the meetings and contracts and victories creating a bubble where empathy became optional. He forgot that people mattered, that details mattered, that small moments, like a rainy night or a simple signature, could ripple far beyond his immediate view. He thought control was in schedules, in numbers, in polished presentations. He forgot it could also live in patience, in memory, in quiet persistence. She finally speaks, not with anger, not with triumph. Her voice is even calm, measured. "I didn't come to embarrass you," she says, letting it sink in. A pause hangs in the room. Every pair of eyes turns to her. Even Richard listens fully now, as if hearing someone for the first time. Then she continues, slower, deliberate. "I came to finish what you started." That statement lands heavier than any accusation, heavier than laughter ever could. It reframes everything, not as revenge, not as conquest, but as closure, as justice shaped by time and patience. And in that moment, the moral lines blur. She didn't steal from him. She didn't manipulate him. She simply let the past complete itself. And now the room has to reckon with the truth. Power isn't just seized. Sometimes, it's returned. She stands a moment longer, letting the tension settle like fog over the city below. Then she speaks, slowly, carefully, as if every word carries the weight of 15 years. "My mother," she begins, voice soft but steady. "She stood in the rain that night, alone, because she had no choice, no money, no umbrella, no one to lean on. She survived, kept going, so I could survive too. I never contacted you because it wasn't my fight to finish at the time. That night, the pen in your hand, the tea you offered, the 5 minutes you listened. They were small, fleeting gestures, but they were enough." She lets it sink in, watching faces around the table change, waiting for comprehension to arrive fully. "The signature you signed that night," she continues, tracing her fingers over the creased paper. "It wasn't meant to matter then, but it did. And the rain, I remembered it before I ever remembered your face. And the tea, that small kindness, it taught me patience." She takes a quiet breath, folding her hands in front of her. Then she looks directly at him, eyes steady, unwavering. "You didn't change my life because you were powerful. You changed it because you were kind. Once." The room goes still. Not a single laugh, not a muttered word. Just the weight of time, memory, and choices converging on a single moment, showing everyone that power alone does not shape destiny. Quiet kindness does, and sometimes, that's enough to change everything. Richard rises slowly, the room watching every careful movement. He doesn't argue. He doesn't protest. There is no shouting, no accusations, no public humiliation. Just a long, quiet understanding settling over him, the kind that comes when someone realizes they were never the villain. They were simply blind to what truly mattered. He nods once, almost imperceptibly, and steps back from the table, leaving space where authority now quietly shifts. She doesn't seize power with anger. She doesn't gloat. She takes control with purpose, steady hands, and patience forged over years of waiting. Her goal isn't to destroy what came before, but to rebuild it better, stronger, fairer. The boardroom, once filled with laughter and dismissal, now hums with attention and respect. Decisions are made deliberately, voices are heard, and the work begins, not as a conquest, but as restoration. And in that calm, unshakable moment, the story reaches its conclusion. Justice arrived, not through vengeance, but through patience, grace, and the quiet power of one life lived thoughtfully. Do you think one small act of kindness should carry this much weight? Or do we only value what we remember, long after the moment has passed. Think about that. If the story moved you, give it a like. And subscribe for stories that stay with you. Stories about patience, quiet strength, and the moments that quietly change everything.